Welcome back. This is Professor TOVANCHE, and today we're going to be talking about slavery in English America, what would become the United States as well. Um, we're probably not going to get through this entire section in one sort of sitting, so I'll probably break this video up into two. We'll see how that goes. So I just want to take a little broad picture here because we have to remember that a lot of European countries, a lot of Europeans are coming over. We know that by the early 1600s, a lot of them are coming over, right? The Portuguese, they're here already by the 1530s. They're not in what would become the United States. They're not in North America. They're mostly, of course, in Brazil. The Spanish, though, they're in charge during the 1500s. The Spanish are going to dominate exploration all the way up until about 1600, early 1600. They're going to, of course, uh, explore to the tip of South America, up through Central America, into what is today Mexico, and also what is today the U.S. Southwest, places like California, Texas, U.S. Southwest, and of course in Florida. So uh, all of these countries coming over, they're going to be, of course, vying for power in the West, and all of them are going to be using slave labor to do it. We know that the French start coming also by 1600. The Dutch also are going to be coming over here. Now they're going to actually land in not just in the Caribbean, but also in what would become the United States, just like Spain. Spain's in Florida in the U.S. Southwest. The French, they're going to, in fact, settle in around what is today Louisiana, right? So you might be familiar with this, I think. Louisiana still has a very strongly French culture. The French, of course, are going to be up in the what is the Great Lakes region, um, and in Canada. And so they're going to be situated in places that are today the United States, just like the Dutch. The Dutch are going to settle in places like what is today Manhattan Island. And so they're going to leave their mark. Now, what's going to be different about these people is that they're not really, the Dutch and the French aren't really going to settle. They're still looking to trade mostly and looking for what they call a Northwest Passage to India. These people believe, a lot of people believe, if not most people at this time who are coming over, that there is some waterway that will take them from the Atlantic Ocean through the continent. Of course, they didn't really realize how big this continent was. And there is no Northwest Passage. There is no waterway from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? And so they're going to invest a lot of their energies in this Northwest Passage. In the meantime, they're going to, and eventually they're going to turn really just to trade. They're going to trade a lot, but they're never really going to settle. Now, we know they also engage in slavery. They also have their own sorts of dealings with native peoples, but it's going to be relatively different because the English, they're not just going to exploit labor and trade and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, they're going to actually settle in large numbers, huge numbers. English settlers who travel across the ocean and who eventually found the United States, they're going to come here in huge numbers. Now, initially, they're not coming here to establish a new nation. They're not coming here to, in fact, because they want religion. Now, this is something that a lot of my students still believe, that people came here for religious freedom. They certainly did not come here for religious freedom for all. A lot of them, particularly in the North, what is New England, came here for religious reasons, but not for religious freedom for all. These people, of course, were fleeing religious persecution for sure, but the people who came over here, the Puritans and so forth, they would have said that their religion is superior. They don't they would not have understood our modern ideas of religious freedom. this idea of no government intervention and so forth. No, these people who come to New England are going to, in fact, uh, 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 create societies based on their religion. They are fleeing, of course, the Protestant Reformation. Um, Really, they are agents of it in a sense. What I mean by that, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. You're probably familiar with it. You should at least be somewhat familiar with Protestant Reformation if you're not already. I want to tell you that around the time of the 1500s, the Catholic Church, which had held sway over the lives of countless people in Europe, that Catholic Church was breaking up. So Christianity was sort of crumbling already in the 1500s, and this Protestant Reformation was intent on reforming the Catholic Church, which Protestants believed was corrupt for many reasons. We're not going to go into. The point is that yes, they escaped religious persecution, but they didn't come here because they thought that everybody should deserve religious freedom. Now, a lot of people who come here are going to actually, we're going to sort of flesh this out a little bit more down the road, but a lot of people who come here for economic reasons. Most people who come here actually come for economic reasons. And so most come to escape poverty. Excuse me. England in the 1500s and early 1600s it's filled with poor people. If you've ever seen any Monty Python, right? I think was it The Search for the Holy Grail? But anyway, they sort of spoof this, right? That living as a poor person in England at this time was a horrible existence. You're poor, you didn't have a lot to eat, you died early, and so forth. And so a lot of these people want to escape poverty. There's no land for them in England, and so when they hear about this new land out there across the ocean, they're thinking, you know what, I'm going to try my chances. And of course, the wealthy want to come, right? The wealthy believe that, hey, I have money, I want to invest in some sort of venture across the ocean that might make me some more money. So there's a strong economic component here among the ordinary folk. So we have different sorts of motivations. For the English monarchs and the rich folk, right? These people, of course, especially the English monarchs, right? The king, the crown, they're interested in the three G's, right? Gold, glory, and God. Right? They, of course, want to enrich their nation. They want glory for the nation, as does Spain. And, of course, they want to actually push their agenda with regard to their religion, God. Remember, this all ties into the Protestant Reformation. And by this time, in fact, the English monarchs are able to sort of stoke the fires of motivation among the ordinary citizenry. They say, that is the English monarchs, they promote this idea that the Spanish are horrendous, that the Spanish are tyrannical. In fact, this idea of the black legend, or in Spanish, leyenda negra, really, because it's applied to the Spanish, the black legend is this idea that the Spanish were atrocious in their approach to colonization. The English would say, hey, we're going to go colonize over there and we're going to do things better. We're not going to treat native peoples the way the Spanish do. We're not going to treat slaves the way, the Spanish do. But of course, that's not true. It doesn't end up being true. They do, the English are going to engage in all kinds of atrocities against native peoples and, of course, African peoples. But here's the point, that the English monarchs are realizing that people have this religious fervor, and so they're going to use that. They're going to push this idea of a holier than thou, a self-righteous sort of conquest of lesser peoples. Now, the early English, when they come here, they're going to settle in what is I mean, this is going to be like the first area that the English actually come to settle, right? This is called the Chesapeake area, Maryland, Virginia, which really is going to be considered part of the South later on. But when they come here, they're going to settle in this area. They're also going to settle, of course, later on in New England. We'll get to that. But they're going to settle, of course, very famously, the very first permanent English settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement. There had been English settlements before, right? Roanoke and all that kind of stuff, which you're probably familiar with, being, with of course New England, but it wasn't permanent. There were these small sort of ventures of English settlements, but they weren't permanent, and there were other permanent settlements that weren't English. In fact, the oldest town in the United States today is a Spanish town, was a Spanish town today in Florida. It's obviously not a Spanish town, but it still has that Spanish sort of feel to it, I'm told. Never been there. But St. Augustine was the first permanent city in what would become the United States. It was the first permanent town, now a city, that would become the United States, but it wasn't English. So Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement, right? And so we know that Jamestown, had this English people come here, the men come here in 1607 or so. There's like 100 plus men and boys, and they're initially searching for gold and silver, and they also are searching for a passage to India. And these men come here believing in some sort of paradise. They think it's going to be a wonderful climate, right? There's going to be lots of food everywhere hanging from the trees. It's going to be great. The friendly people are going to meet us, these docile natives. If they're not friendly with us, then we'll just go ahead and just bum rush them. We're going to have a good time here. Now, of course, they find everything except that. They don't find a wonderful climate. They find hot and humid climates where malaria spreads through the swamps. So they find a lot of disease, right? And of course, they find hostile native peoples. Now, eventually, these native peoples are not hostile to them, but the Jamestown settlers from England, they're gonna actually start becoming much more sort of they're gonna hit this time called the starving time, and this is when things are gonna get really bad. Although they were kind of getting a little bit bad in terms of relations with natives before that. The natives, in fact, taught them how to plant stuff and try to survive. But when times got tough, the Jamestown settlers turned against them, and it's every man and community for itself. So eventually what happens is that a drought hits and starvation hits. It's called the starving time, when people actually engage in cannibalism. There are very convincing accounts of this. And so for a time, it looks like this is not going to survive. You got to remember, these people find it difficult to live off the land. The people that come over here and that keep coming, they kind of trickle in here and there. These are gentlemen. These are men who had invested in the venture, the Jamestown venture. In fact, the Jamestown venture was privately funded. It was given the stamp of approval by the king, King James, of course, but it was privately funded. It was called the Virginia Company, right? And so people have an investment in this. So these gentlemen came over and they decided they're going to come over and get some adventure and kind of see what their money's going to get them. It was them and a bunch of unskilled poor workers who were coming over here. And so these guys do not know how to actually survive on the land. Now, eventually, they will turn to that, right? By 1611, they're starting to turn to that kind of thing, and they're forgetting, this idea of, gold in them their hills, right? They're not searching for gold as much, or silver. They're not searching for the Northwest Passage, really. What they decide is that they need a cash crop. And in fact, they hit brown gold, so to speak. And what I'm talking about, of course, is tobacco. Tobacco is going to be a boon for them. I mean, the Virginia soil and climate is great for this stuff, and they start growing tobacco, and Europeans are smoking it up, man. They think it's the coolest thing ever, right? It's the greatest thing. They never had this before, to smoking tobacco. Of course, they had other things to smoke, but there's this idea of smoking, and they thought it was good for your health and so forth, and so excuse me. So this becomes a cash crop. It's going to make a lot of money, but in order to make a lot of money with this thing, you need a lot of workers. Tobacco is very labor intensive. When I took U.S. history, my professor took 20 minutes telling us how tobacco is grown and processed, and I was like, oh my God, more than I wanted to know about that. But it shows that it is labor intensive, and that's what you need to know. And because of that, you need a lot of workers. Now, the native peoples, right? The English tried to excuse me, tried to enslave them, but the native peoples aren't having it, right? They're fighting back, largely not having it. And there are very, very few English settlers at this time, and so the leaders of Jamestown realized we need to import workers. We need to bring people over here, and they experiment with a variety of workers. They actually bring over a bunch of orphans. Unfortunately for these kids, right? The idea is, well, might as well put them to work somewhere else. They empty out their orphanages and so forth. So they're starting to try to bring people over here to work. They don't bring convicts. A lot of people think they brought convicts. No, they didn't bring convicts because convicts, this is a society that's basically on the verge of collapse, and so we don't need any more troublemakers, right, is the thinking. So really what they do is that they turn to largely indentured servants. Indentured servants are going to be a major source of labor at first. And of course, later on, slaves. Um, Now, this whole system, right, and of course, cash crop and indentured servitude and so forth, that's going to be the case. You're going to see these things in other parts of the Chesapeake, meaning specifically Maryland. Maryland. And life in the Chesapeake is really, really hard. Now, I see I put Anthony Johnson there. Don't worry about that for now. I will come back to him. But life in the Chesapeake, Virginia and Maryland, is hard. You have rich landowners who are taking a lot of land, and you have a very harsh climate with lots of disease. And so they're still finding it really, really difficult to bring people over, but they bring over these indentured servants. Indentured servants, as you probably know, are people who I guess it could have been a little faster on this. Here you see at the top, right, planters take most of the land, the climate is labor intensive, and so forth. Tobacco is labor intensive, and so forth. Point is, they're going to advertise for people to come over, as you can see in these ads, to work under a labor contract for some 4 to 7 years, right? Now, why would anybody do this? I mean, it's backbreaking labor. It's harsh. You don't have much freedom. So you have to wonder, well, why, right? Well, there's not a whole lot in England at this time going on for you. So if you're a poor dude, and you probably are, you're generally poor, you're generally hungry, right? You're going to come over here. And now that doesn't really change. You're still going to be poor and hungry as an indentured servant, but you are going to have some hope for change, because after your contract, you work your time, you can get you get your freedom. You're your own man, so to speak, your own woman, because women come too, and you maybe get some land perhaps from your former boss, indentured servant, indentured master, I guess. They weren't really masters in the sense of slaves. These people, these servants had still the rights of Englishmen and so forth, but because they had a contract, right? And so you could, if you were an indentured servant, get some freedom after your contract, maybe get some land, or if you came over because somebody promised you a skilled trade in exchange for your work, you could be someone with a skilled trade. You could be a wagon wheel maker or whatever it is, right? And so a lot of these people are coming over here because they're thinking, I have a chance. I have a chance. So young people come over. They're mostly poor, as I said, and hungry still. A lot of them are men. Most of them are men. A lot of women. And in fact, what we see coming over, the type of person we see coming over, are the Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish are going to settle in the Chesapeake and into the lower South as the colonies expand. Now, we're going to see all these people, working side by side, living dreary lives. They're poor, so they die early, right? Much like today, poor people today die earlier than rich people. Not only because of the lack of health insurance and health care, but because of things like a bad diet or high stress levels. Point is, these people die early. They must obey the master of their contract, and if they don't, they are subject to severe punishment, and sometimes, and all too often, they're cheated out of the land that they were promised. They might get nothing, they might get a portion of it, or they might actually get cheated by the master saying, you know what, no, you actually signed up for 5 years and not 4. And you got to remember, a lot of the people who hold these contracts of indentured servants, who hold servants as under indentures, these people tend to be rich. They have the money. They're the ones who paid for you to come over here if you're a servant. Remember that. You didn't pay to come here. I paid if I'm the master, so to speak. I paid for you to get here. That means I have money and I got juice here. I am part of the government. What are you going to do about it? So the point is, these people have some very, very harsh lives. Now, Africans, this is going to be interesting, I think. The very first Africans come to Jamestown in 1619. You may have heard of the New York Times 1619 project. It marks the beginning of U.S. history in 1619 because the idea is that slavery, in fact, contributed not just to the building of the country, but also stays with us today in many negative ways, right? I don't think we need to go too much into that. I think we've recognized that. So for a lot of people, and I suppose the New York Times, 1619 is sort of a seminal moment, a beginning moment, right? When the first Africans arrive in what would become in what was already an English settlement. Now, we should say, of course, Africans were already in Florida way before, but we'll get back to that because the Spanish were here. But the thing is, in 1619, a few dozen people from Angola are deposited at Jamestown by the English ship, the White Lion. Now, they had actually been numbered in the several hundreds, but by the time they get to Jamestown, there are only a couple of dozen, it seems. Excuse me. They had begun a forced journey. They had initially been taken by the Portuguese and then traded along the Atlantic, boarding ship to ship, until they got boarded onto this British ship, the White Lion. Of course, it was certainly against their will. They're not free because they're brought here as captives. They didn't have a choice but to be here. But there's a question as to whether or not these people served as servants or slaves while in Virginia. This is sort of debated. The 1619 project by the New York Times calls these people slaves. They certainly arrive as such because they have no choice. But a few personal accounts raised the question about this. What was life like for them once they got here? We have to recognize that not all Black people in the English colonies were slaves. We should recognize that early on, there were, in fact, people who were not born into slavery, even though they were Black and living in the English colonies. I'll give you an example. A guy named William Tucker. This guy was the first African born in what is today the United States. He is born of 2 African people that arrived. They had arrived on the White Lion. He was free. How is it that these people that arrived on the White Lion gave birth, right, to someone who would be deemed free? There was no law saying otherwise at this time. That's going to change. So the question becomes, were these people slaves? A lot of historians will say no. When they got off the boat, right? When they were on the boat, they were enslaved, right? Because they didn't have any choice. But when they got off the boat, they actually ended up working as indentured servants. I'll give you an example, and I'm going back to Anthony Johnson now, as you can see there. Anthony Johnson arrives from Africa, Angola, in 1621, just a couple of years after the White Lion. So notice they're still coming in, right? By the 1650s, some 30 years later, he's free. He arrives from Africa in 1621. We would think, presumably, a slave. But by the 1650s, he's free. He has actually anglicized his name. He was not born Anthony Johnson. In fact, he had changed his name a couple of times. Apparently, his name was Antonio at one time, whatever. He anglicizes it. And he ends up owning a few hundred acres of land in Virginia in the 1600s. He actually also has servants, indentured servants. So how could Anthony Johnson gain his freedom if he were enslaved? Slavery as we know the term. So what I want to bring home is that the first Africans in 1619 and for a few years thereafter came as captives. They're sold in Jamestown, though, as indentured servants. Like Anthony Johnson, a lot of these black folk had the potential for freedom and land. And in fact, black indentured servants, we know, worked side by side with white indentured servants. So where does this get us? The White Lion captives and Africans in the early years, they come here as slaves, but they live as indentured servants. Slavery is not the norm in early Jamestown for black people. Now, Anthony Johnson's story shows that there's a free black population in the Chesapeake, and in fact, his descendants inherit his land. He's got sons that inherit his land. What a lot of people are sort of surprised to know is that black people, there are some black people living today who can presumably trace their lineage back to these early centuries, right? Hundreds of years ago. There are people who are living today who can trace their time. African American people can trace their line back through the times of slavery, but who were never descended from slaves. From the very beginning, there will be free black people in what will become the United States. A lot of people are surprised by that. If you've ever seen the show, I think it's called Finding Your Roots by Henry Louis Gates. So yeah, it's really a fantastic show, quite interesting. He will do genealogical and historical and archaeological, I guess, sorts of investigations of the lives of famous people. So he did one on LL Cool J. LL Cool J, you may know, was a rapper in the 80s when I was coming up, right? Now he's on one of those terrible CSI shows, but whatever. Dude's like in his 50s. He's still like jacked and huge, and he looks like he's 30. But anyway, this guy, right? LL Cool J, he thought he was descended from slaves because he was black, and that's just kind of how he grew up. But it turns out he wasn't. He was descended from free people. And what's interesting is that whenever there seems to be a tie between, like, if we locate like middle class or successful African Americans, and there's lots of them, if we locate them, they tend to actually come from families that were never enslaved. That's interesting. Now they're still doing, research on that, but that's what it seems to be. That's the message that comes out of this, it seems. So slavery is not the norm in early Jamestown for black folk. But despite all that, we can't take this too far. The color line is hardening. Color is recognizable in early Jamestown. Black and white indentured servants, they're not treated equally. The black servants normally have longer indentures, right? A longer contract. They get harsher punishments. So the physical punishment is going to be coming more forth. It's going to be more likely that if you're a black indentured servant, you're more likely you're going to get hit. And when you do get hit, it's going to be worse than it would be if the white guy is getting hit, or white woman, right? So they have uh, longer physical punishments. I'm sorry, harsher physical punishments, and in fact are much more likely to have extensions of their indenture. So I'll give you an example. There's a guy named John Punch that lives in Virginia around 1640. And by the way, I'll give you dates just so you kind of know where we're at. I'm not going to ask you, what date did this happen? That's not going to be a question. You should know dates like 1776 and that kind of stuff, right? I mean, that's obvious. But, the fact that, John Punch lived in 1640 Virginia, well, it's enough to say he lived in the early decades of the 1600s, right? In the Chesapeake, Virginia. Anyway, the point is just kind of know where you are in place and time. So John Punch was a black indentured servant. He actually runs away, and he's accompanied by 2 white indentured servants. Now, a couple of things here. First of all, they're running away together. That shows you that they feel like they are in the same boat, so to speak, right? So they're running away together. And so it should also point to the fact that there's a sense of camaraderie and perhaps even friendship here. There were interracial relationships going on here. Now, these men, I think they were all men, are captured. The white servants are ordered to serve 1 more year under their contract. Right? So because you ran away, you owe me money. I'm going to sue in court. The court says you have to actually serve this guy for another year. Okay, fine. John Punch, he doesn't get sentenced to 1 more year of service. He gets sentenced to life for his, quote, natural life. So what does Punch's case show? Well, the color line exists, first of all. And we know that because, the black he was treated more harshly. And so that's an example of that. And in fact, he is the very first recorded slave in U.S. history. He used to be an indentured servant, but he was the first recorded slave in U.S. history. Now, they didn't do this to the white people. So what you get here is that there's this idea growing that only black people will be considered true slaves. So white indentured servants certainly did not have a good life, but there were already color line differences. At this point, though, black does not equal slave. It's not necessarily so. It's not that all blacks are slaves, but it is that all slaves, if you have any, are black. And so what we start to see is in the Chesapeake, in the early years, this growth of the idea that black people are the only ones who can be enslaved. Now, we should say that the position of black people, though, is not yet set. Anthony Johnson, his story is illuminating because it shows success, but other things as well. What do I mean? Well, first of all, it shows he can rise in society. He owns land, and eventually he owns also slaves. He has property right ownership over he's got property ownership. He has rights over property. He has rights in court. Anthony Johnson. Here's the thing. Anthony Johnson in 1655 has an indentured servant named John Kaser. Anthony Johnson's servant, John Kaser, runs off. He had run off to work for another man. Apparently, he wanted to make some money, this guy, John Kaser. He's captured, Anthony Johnson goes to court because he has rights, although he's a black man. He sues in court for the return of a man. Actually, they don't capture him. The other guy, he's working for the other guy, and John Kaser is working for the other guy, and Anthony Johnson sues because he says, "Hey, give me my property back." In a sense, my indentured servant, who wasn't considered actual property at the time. He's an indentured servant, but he had run off. And the court rules in favor of Anthony Johnson. They say, "Yeah, give that guy back." John Kaser has an indenture under a contract, right, for, with Anthony Johnson. The court says something else, though. It says, "Kaser, you will be sentenced to lifelong servitude to Anthony Johnson." That means slavery. So what are we getting out of this? It's this, and that is that even a black man owned a slave back in the day. Now, be careful what you make of this, because in fact this is going to change. But also, what I want you to understand is that at this time, black does not equal slave. And so slaves had some rights, or excuse me, black people had some rights. Court documents indicate that even slaves had rights. Even slaves had rights. For example, a woman named Elizabeth Key, also in Virginia, living in the 1650s, who was considered what would be called mulatto, half black, half white, right? And of course, that word has fallen into disfavor lately. But that's what they would have called her, a mulatto. She was born of a slave mother. Pay attention to this. She's born of a slave mother and a free white man. Okay. But she was not a slave. She's indentured for a term of years because her mother is a slave. Her mother, being a slave, meant that her child at this time would be an indentured servant to someone. Elizabeth Key, who's had a white father, as I said, he sues for her freedom because English law at the time said that a child's status follows that of the father. And that's historically true. For a long time, even the United States had rules like that. The idea is that that a child is born and is really in the household of the father, right? Born into that family. Child status follows that of the father. Well, her father ends up dying. She marries an Englishman who happens to be an attorney. So she's a mulatto woman. She marries this white attorney who eventually wins the case. And the court says this woman was born, and here's why she wins, right? She was born of a free man, and she herself was baptized. So they're looking at the lineage. They're saying that it's the man that matters, and she's Christian. You can't do this to her. So, I said slaves have rights, but really, in a sense, black indentured servants have rights. So she was a mulatto woman who had rights to sue. So when she wins this case, it's still not clear what it means to be a black person here. But this is going to change. This idea that being born of a free man will set you free, and the idea that being a Christian will set you free, that's going to change. So the status of black people, though, at this time is not clear. Also, think about something. What's interesting is that there was interracial marriage going on here and interracial relationships. First of all, Elizabeth Key was born of an interracial black-white relationship. Then herself, half black, marries a white attorney. So this stuff is happening. But these relationships, the black-white relationship is very complex. They're fraught with tension. In fact, Anthony Johnson, by the way, just for example, he's not immunized by his wealth. He has, in fact, to leave Virginia for Maryland because there's a lot of prejudice and harassment. So there's a lot of poor whites in Virginia who say, hey, why does that black man have something I don't? He escapes the prejudice and harassment, goes to Maryland where things are a little bit better for him, apparently. But he leaves, and this is at a time that slavery is beginning to take shape in the Chesapeake. We have to recognize that in the early decades of English settlement in the United States, what would become the United States, all sorts of people were working side by side in tobacco fields. There were white servants, there were black servants under indentures, there were white landowners who would sometimes get in there as well because you need to get the work done and you don't always have enough hands. So white landowners would sometimes get, roll up their sleeves. And you had black slaves. Now, I should tell you, there were no, as we understand it, there were no white slaves. Yes, there were people who were to some degree unfree, but again, these were the indentures, the indentured. So white indentured servants, black indentured servants, white landowners, black slaves, all of them working side by side. All sorts of people existing and living with each other, black and white people running away together, living together, marrying each other. But they weren't equal. And the color line was beginning to harden. And in fact, Virginia already by the 1650s had started to actually differentiate white and black people. Virginia law will sharpen the distinction. I'll just give you some examples. They're going to differentiate, separate out black women. In 1643, the colony of Virginia is going to put a tax on all workers except white women. If you're a worker, you have to pay a tax unless you're a worker who happens to be a white woman. If you are a white man, you pay the tax. If you are a black woman, you pay the tax. But if you're a white woman, you do not. So this creates a distinction between white and black, particularly between white women and black women. It leads to this idea that black women are going to largely be identified as workers, particularly field workers. There's some domestic stuff going on there in terms of domestic workers, but most likely you're going to have a poor white woman as a domestic worker, and a black woman is going to be working in the field, and they're going to be taxed as workers, when white women will not be. So they're creating a distinction here, not just racial, but sex, gendered, whatever term you want to use. You know what I mean? The idea is that black women are not expected to be a part of the community of women who are needed for the colony to reproduce. Women are needed for a colony, a settlement to succeed. But there's this idea that black women are set apart. White women's work is not taxed because it was assumed that it was going to be domestic work. And so you see these early laws starting to make distinctions. In 1662, laws are going to affirm this difference in the minds of white folk. Virginia will adopt what would become known as slave codes. And in 1662, it reverses that whole Elizabeth Key thing. Remember Elizabeth Key, born of a free white man and an enslaved mother? Well, they're going to change that. In 1662, a person's status under the law will be based on what they call condition of the mother. At the time of your birth, if your mother was free, you are free. Doesn't matter what color you are. At the time of your birth, though, if your mother was a slave, and by the way, that means she's black, then you are a slave. So notice this applies only to black women, because only black people are going to be slaves. So you can no longer claim, if you are a slave woman, that your child is free because it was because the child was fathered by a free man. It doesn't matter if that free man was black or white. He doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the woman. Is she a slave? So notice what this does. I mean, it's creating, of course, greater distinctions, but it's also now creating a financial reason, along with all the other motivations that a man would have, but a financial reason to have sex with female slaves. You can create more property this way. Because if I am a white slave holder and I have sex with my slave, I'm never going to recognize that child as my own. On some level, I'm human, I get it, but that child is my property. So not only do I have, if I'm this person, all these, let's put them, manly reasons for wanting to have sex with this girl, I also have a financial reason now because of this law. You can create more property. And these people were property. They are going to be considered chattel. 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 Chattel is pure property. It's like a horse. It's any property except for like land. Your 30 acres or 40 acres or whatever it is of land, that's not considered chattel. That's real estate. But a chair, a pen, a cell phone, all that is chattel. These people were chattel. And only black people are going to be seen this way. Now, we should recognize that, a white indentured woman's life can also be harsh. For example, white women can't marry without the permission of the master. If they become pregnant, they have their indenture extended for about a year. If they have a child, the white indentured woman would have that child taken away from her and be made to work, not as a slave. That child would do it temporarily until the white mother's indentured contract was over. So the child would go off, would also be under an indenture to work under the contract of the mother. So my point is, white indentured women have it harsh. They can't marry without permission. They have, and if they get pregnant, they're going to get their time extended. If they have children taken away from them during the indenture and so forth. If they have, but black women have it much worse. They also have to suffer these sorts of humilities, but it's going to be worse, and only black women can be slaves. In 1667, they step it up, and they pass a law saying that Christianity can't save you from slavery. Again, Elizabeth Key, right? One of the things about Elizabeth Key is that she was born of a free white man, and she was Christian. None of these applies anymore because of the 1662 law, and now the 1667 law is in place. Christianity can't save you from slavery. This law will ease the conscience of Christians, and it will further sharpen the differences between the races. And in 1691, we're going to see further separation. Interracial marriage between whites and others is outlawed. Now, this is interesting because, if you're a brown person, you can marry a black person. But interracial marriage between whites and others is outlawed. Oh, and by the way, this doesn't change until 1967, when the Supreme Court says that a state cannot prevent marriage between white people and other people. And by the way, it was Virginia. It was a case regarding the state of Virginia. 1967. Some of you have parents, or if not parents, certainly grandparents who were alive at that time. Maybe you were alive at this time. I don't know. Most of my students were not. So interesting also is that, they're passing laws against interracial marriage and even against interracial cohabitation, by the way. But this marriage one is interesting. Think about why they're doing this. Laws are passed only to address what is already happening, which means that they're passing a law because they don't want it to keep happening. What does this tell you? That black people and white people were getting together. They're working side by side in these fields as indentured servants, and they're people, and they look over and they're like, yeah, that looks okay to me, right? I'm gonna get with this person, and so they would get together and sometimes married. Well, that's gonna end. And there were many examples of these so-called mulatto children running around at this time, and so they outlaw it and they punish both. If you're a white person who marries a person outside of your race, you're going to be banished. You'll be sent. If you're a man, you're going to be banished. If you're a white woman, you're going to be indentured. So if you actually marry or actually have sexual relationships as a white woman with a black man, then you will be indentured, and your kid will be too. If you're a white man, you're going to be banished from the colony. And so the idea is separation, right? The black person, of course, if they're indentured servant, they're also going to have their indenture extended. Now, I haven't come across any instances in which they were enslaved, though I cannot see how that would not have happened, right? It seems like it would fit. Why did the English make this turn away from slavery, from indentured servitude towards slavery? Excuse me. Trying to see how much time I have here. Maybe I will. I've been going for about an hour, I think. I'm going to go ahead and cut this here before we get into this question of why. So the next time I will start here from servitude to slavery. And we'll talk about how there's a change. Because a lot of my students don't recognize this society that I've just kind of laid out for you, right? In broad strokes, people who are interracially married and so forth and all that. A lot of my students are surprised by this. So the question will become, why? Why did it switch? What happened? And embedded in all of this is this question of, did racism cause slavery, or did slavery cause racism? So maybe we'll get into that question next time, but that is embedded in this whole thing, right? Which came first, slavery or racism? All right, people, I will cut it there, and I will post this as like episode 1 or something of this section. Okay, people, take care, be well, be good.